Welcome to the Illuminating Primary Care Podcast.
Hi, welcome to the Illuminating Primary Care Podcast. My name is Victoria Ashton. I head up the Management in Healthcare division. I'm joined by the lovely Julie Dixon, who is an experienced practice manager from the Northeast. Hello, Julie.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I'd like to thank you for agreeing to take part in today's podcast. I know we've had some interesting conversations over the last couple of days. Today, we're going to be discussing the modern day practice manager and obviously how things have changed compared to how it used to be. And one of the first things I want to speak to you about is obviously the workload of a practice manager. I am aware that you are a member of a forum with around 4,700 practice manager members. So what's the general feeling amongst your peers when it comes to their workload?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I've only been in general practice for 6 years, having been in other areas in the NHS, and I've got colleagues who have been around for 20, 30 years. And the landscape has massively changed, even from the 6 years when I started in general practice. Of course, pretty much after that, we had a pandemic and we also had the invention of primary care networks. So it's massively increased since even I started 6 years ago. Not only am I part of a forum, and obviously I hear this in the forum all the time, workload, workload, workload. But there's also a survey that's done by Management in Practice, and I have to name them because they do a really good job with this. They get a lot of feedback from practice managers on a national basis. And basically, the scope of the job is so huge that this survey has shown that 65% of practice managers stating that the workload is too high, way too high for us to manage. Having said that, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom when we're talking about things that are really escalating within primary care. And there's a lovely quote, and I'm just going to read this out from this survey that says, "There is strong evidence of a committed profession that derives great satisfaction from the work it does and takes pride in doing it well. Nevertheless, many are being pushed to their limit, with a significant proportion wanting to leave." So it's worth mentioning that. It's worth mentioning that the general feeling is we still love primary care, we're dedicated to our jobs, but slowly and gradually in the background, this workload that we're faced with is increasing. And if you think about the scope of a practice manager, and this does differ from practice to practice, you can have a smaller practice where one practice manager deals with everything. She may have a deputy or an office manager. And in the bigger practices, you'll have a different level of management. So you might have a practice manager, an ops manager, a finance manager, IT manager, because all of those come under the scope of our workload. The management of staff, HR and payroll, CQC and governance, IT and data security, compliance, quality, purchasing and procurement, business planning, patient liaison and communication. It's so broad that even if you have that level of different managers, different types of managers and support, when you are a single practice manager, you are doing literally everything. And really, the amount of patients sometimes doesn't matter, because the actual physical doing the job and all the systems that we have to tap into to add data to and to claim finance, it's all the same regardless of how many patients there are. So it's pretty big.
So basically, I mean, the role of a practice manager is clearly extensive.
Yeah.
You need to be a bit of a jack of all trades, as the old saying goes.
Yeah.
I imagine it can get overwhelming at times. So, what support do you receive to ensure that the practice runs smoothly?
Well, what I would say is, first of all, you need to be a very resilient person to be jack of all trades. You need to have some grit and gumption, as they used to say back in the day. You have to have a lot of motivation and not be fazed by things. But the support that we get, again, it varies up and down the country. There's definitely a lot of peer support goes on within local practices, and as well as in a forum, for example. Um, of course, we're all under a great deal of work pressure, so it's very difficult taking time out to support other practice managers, but somehow we do it. And especially, say, within a primary care network, if you're lucky to be geographically in line with everybody else, and you can have meetings and you can support each other that way, because there's always different levels of expertise amongst the practice managers. So, and it doesn't matter if you've been there 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the landscape changes so much that we're all sometimes asking the questions, how do we do this? Has anybody done that? And so there's a lot of support, and that's really important, because that can easily become crisis management if you need quick answers, quick solutions to things, within the day-to-day working of the practice. And the practice partners, really, that is where a tremendous amount of support needs to come from. And again, that does differ. It's no different to any other organisation. It is a business, and not all partners are very experienced in business, so a lot of the weight goes onto the practice manager's shoulders. But they still can be practical and proactive in supporting the practice manager. And so, yeah, we'll see different levels of that up and down the country. And that's also bearing in mind that the GP partners also have a massive workload, and the increase in primary care, the situation for them. So that's not an easy thing to do. Legally, there is no support for practice managers in terms of, how clinical staff will have, like the MDU and various organisations like that. But I think we're going to see a change in that as well, so that there's certainly more support for practice managers just when things might get a little bit tricky and you just might need some support in that area. Many practices are seeing a drop in the profits, and therefore they're unable to consider some of the things that would be supportive for the practice managers in terms of recruiting more staff. In an ideal world, a practice manager would look at delegation within the practice if they could, because that not only helps the practice manager, but it also helps the rest of the team, where they can expand their knowledge and learn new skills, and then that's the best thing that we can do. However, that's not always possible, again, depending on the size of the practice. We should be looking at succession planning as well, so that the support is growing underneath us. There's apprenticeship schemes, and we should always be looking at that kind of thing. And also, the practice manager does rely massively on the team. They kind of sit in the middle, don't they? They've got the big team of receptionists and clinical staff, salary GPs, nurses, and then above we have the partners. So we sit in the middle, and it's kind of a balancing act. So I think the support from the wider team to the practice manager is invaluable, and that's a good thing to have.
I know firsthand that recruiting the right practice managers is extremely hard. As we've already established, they need to have many skills and the right personality fit as well. I see hundreds of adverts from surgeries up and down the country advertising for practice managers. What's your experience been like with such hires when you were supporting and helping out other practices?
So so it's interesting. So because you've noticed there's a lot of jobs out there for practice managers, and that's because practice managers are leaving the practice for various reasons. I mean, there's a large percentage of practice managers who are at retirement age, and and if you haven't got your succession planning in place, then you're going to be left with your vacancy. So, in my experience, in my local area, the recruitment of practice managers has not been as difficult as it is in other parts of the country. And I can't really judge what that is all about. But there's several things that um, an experienced practice manager would do to support the other practices. I mean, we already know it's a high pressure environment. We know that it takes a certain person to come and take this role. And there are practice managers who come in and they've got transferable skills. But I think the scope of the scope of the role isn't always understood, and it's very hard to explain how diverse that it is. So transferable skills are always a bonus because, like, if you've done payroll in one organization, payroll is a similar set of principles. It might be a different setup, but the whole scope of how general practice works is very different, and it can often be a big learning curve for anybody coming into it. And that's the same not just at practice manager level. For example, if you're recruiting a receptionist and a receptionist has been a receptionist in a dental practice, they think it's going to be the same in general practice. And again, it is a very, very different role. When somebody rings into a GP surgery, you have no idea what they're going to ask on the end of that phone. Whereas in a dentist, it's very just like, can I have a dental appointment and bits and pieces, but it's huge. And also recruiting practice managers. If you're going to take somebody on who has say less experience, you need to look after them when they join. So they need some mentoring and coaching that can be as ongoing as long as it's needed, really. I've heard of practice managers who've been taken into a practice and have not had even a very lengthy handover. And as I say, the scope of the business is so big, that's really important. So that is something that I think we need to be looking more into to say to ourselves, look, we're not going to get that many experienced practice managers moving now from practice to practice to practice to practice. It's bringing the new people in, looking at their skills, and then looking at how we can support them straight away.
So obviously, yeah, that leads us nicely on to retention of practice managers. I'm aware that in the Management in Practice survey, it highlights mounting concerns around practice manager satisfaction and retention in UK general practice, with 39%, I believe it was, of respondents indicating they're considering leaving their roles in the next 12 months. So it's clear substantive action is needed to hold on to these important team members. What has been the overarching reason, do you think, for dissatisfaction amongst practice managers, and how could that possibly be addressed?
I think that question is a wrap up of what we've been talking about. This is the reasons practice managers are leaving is definitely workload. You can get similar jobs at similar levels in different industries that are less pressurized as what we have now in general practice. And I think it's only fair that we should mention salary as well. Um, if you can get a better salary and less stress and pressure, then that's what you're going to go for. If we looked at the survey that was done by Management in Practice, you will see an enormous variation of a practice manager's salary. And of course, yes, we are still talking about smaller practice, bigger practices, and you'd think that would make sense, but it actually doesn't. It doesn't mean to say that if you're in a smaller practice, you're getting a smaller salary. You can actually get a bigger salary. And we looked, it started anyway over 65,000, 70,000 pounds a year and goes as low as 20,000. And so it's a bit difficult to figure this out. But again, talking to colleagues, talking to practice managers, you see in the forum, it's not like the forum's made of practice managers moaning about this, that, and other, but they're real concerns. When they say, look, I've just taken a practice manager's role, or I've been I've been a substitute practice manager for a year, and she's not coming back. They've offered me a job and they've offered me this amount of money. Everybody's always asking the questions and finding out that, sometimes the pay can be really bad. And then sometimes it can be good. Of course, also, there is this trend moving towards practice managers being paid a bonus. But again, when the survey looked into it, it's not necessarily a proper bonus structure based around targets and goals and all of those things. It can just be what the partners feel they've got to give, which really doesn't make much sense in the corporate world, in the private world, because that doesn't really happen like that. So pay, workload is hampering retention, but also things like a continuous professional development, a lack of that perhaps for practice managers. There's many practice managers who self-fund a lot of things, and to develop your leadership skills, that's an ongoing thing, and especially if you're a new practice manager coming in and you're starting and you're just kind of figuring this all out, you really need the support of continuous professional development. It tends to be favoured towards the clinical teams because that's how it's always been. But now I think there's a recognition that practice managers should be given the credit for what they're doing. So I think some accreditation scheme is already in the pipeline for practice managers, because we're not accredited officially. So if we looked at it as a profession, we've been working as a professional person for many, many years with no accreditation, no real support, a huge variance in salaries and an increasing workload. That's kind of summing it all up, I guess, into this ball. But having also the joy to say that, a huge amount of us, despite all of that, are really happy and love the arena of primary care. And of course, also attached to that is sometimes at management level, you get your head down and you get on, and you don't always speak up, and you always just accept, well, this is my job. And there is a large amount of that going on as well. And maybe we should have more time to discuss things like that. Again, it's hard to explain to somebody how ferociously busy a day is in a GP practice. And you can go in the morning and you can have the best intentions in the world, and before you know it, the IT's not working, the plumber needs calling, somebody's been sick in the waiting room. Do you know what I mean? It's never ending. But it's I think it's good for the soul that there is that much variation within that particular role. But those are definitely factors that mean, it's hard to retain practice managers and it's hard to recruit them.
I know we've had a few chats before today's podcast, and I know overall that you love what you do for a living. So I know we've had quite a serious conversation about what practice managers are experiencing at the moment, how they feel about situations, and ideas on how things can be improved. But it's nice to know that from the statistics, at least, or from the survey from management practice, that overall, practice managers are happy, but obviously there's always that room for improvement, and hopefully things will continue to evolve, but in a positive direction, and long may the role of the practice manager continue with all the necessary support that you deserve. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do today's podcast with me. Your insight has been really, really interesting, and I hope we get to speak again soon. We will be having another podcast with Tracy Dell in a couple of weeks or so. She's a practice manager in West Yorkshire. Again, we'll be talking about the role of the modern day practice manager, and we'll be going into details on practice managers that have more of a portfolio career. So I hope you will join us at the next podcast. Once again, Julie, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can chat again soon. You take care.
Thank you. you.